right, welcome to another broadcast with the North Carolina Masonic Research Society, and we are thrilled to have back Mitch Horowitz, renowned author, speaker, television personality. Mitch is really everywhere, and we're just always so fortunate to have him here. And tonight he has a very timely and apropos topic, depression and metaphysics, what helps and what hurts. This is a time of year where many people are suffering from depression, especially around the holidays, and 2020 has been exceptionally rough on people. So I think Mitch is going to shed some insight on that and tell us exactly what helps, what hurts, and maybe where we can look for some inspiration or some light in dark times. So Mitch, with that, welcome, glad to have you. If you would just unmute yourself, Mitch.
Thank you. Appreciate that very much, Matt. And I want to extend my thanks to Matt Parker and to the North Carolina Masonic Research Society and other Masonic lodges for sponsoring tonight's program. It's very meaningful to me to be able to speak to you on the theme of depression and metaphysics. It's so central to the spiritual search, and yet it's a topic that I think is often neglected or mishandled within many spiritual circles, which is part of what we're going to discuss tonight. And we're also going to discuss practical ideas and solutions. And I'm very grateful to everyone who's participating tonight. As Matt was alluding in his introduction, not only is the holiday season traditionally a very difficult time for many people who feel themselves under terrible stress during a period of time in which we're supposed to be engaged in revelry and outreach. But of course, 2020 has been a year of unprecedented difficulty for everyone in this country. I think it's probably the first time in memory since the era of the First World War that America and other nations have been locked down due to a pandemic, and I'll try to speak very directly about that as well. This topic of depression and metaphysics is extremely important to me, as I know it is to many of you participating tonight, because the simple fact is, many of us, myself included, come to the spiritual search in whole or in part because we are struggling with either depression or anxiety or a sense of frustrated expression, frustrated self-expression, frustrated agency, a sense that we're not living the life that we're intended to be, a sense of not feeling at home in our own skins, in our own relationships, in our own achievements. And there are a great many people who come to spirituality of various forms for those reasons. I'm among them. I speak from personal experience. I have never really suffered from depression, but anxiety has been my particular burden, although I'm going to revisit that a little bit later in tonight's presentation, because sometimes framing something as a burden or as a malady can be problematic in ways that go beyond just semantics. Sometimes these things are actually very natural states that we pathologize and they don't need fixing. But whatever the case may be, anxiety was a big issue in my life, remains so, but I felt it acutely when I was about 13 years old. My household was being torn apart by divorce. My parents and my sister and I were experiencing just financial disaster. It was a very, very difficult time. And at that time, I think my sense of the spiritual was heightened. I voraciously read an English translation of a Talmudic book called Ethics of the Fathers, or Pirkei Avot. And it's probably the most accessible, most reader-friendly, if I can put it in those terms, book of the Talmud. It's essentially a collection of ethical ideas for good living that come from the Talmud, and I would just reread this book over and over and over, and I can still quote sections of it by heart today. It was one of the most influential books of my life, and what brought me to it was a feeling of being driven to my knees by anxiety, by fear of what tomorrow would bring. And that was a major part of the impetus behind my spiritual search. And I know that's true of a great many people. I am not persuaded, having been on the path of a seeker, like many of you, for many, many years, I am not persuaded that the alternative spiritual culture, by which I mean the radically ecumenical, free-flowing spiritual culture in our nation that doesn't necessarily belong to any one doctrine or congregation, I'm not persuaded that the alternative spiritual culture does a good job at all of dealing with questions of depression, anxiety, and psychological maladies. And I think part of the reason for that is that some of the teachers, authors, leading lights within the alternative spiritual culture who dispense advice at forums like this one are not, in my experience, frank about their own struggles with depression, anxiety, or other psychological maladies. And I say this not casually, and I say it not in judgment. I say it having myself been an editor within spiritual publishing for over 25 years before embarking several years ago full-time, so to speak, on my career as a writer and a speaker. But for many, many years, I was a publisher of New Age, New Thought, and alternative spiritual literature. And I had the mixed blessing of seeing how the sausages get made. And when you see how the sausages get made, it's not always pretty. And I feel very strongly that sometimes people are giving talks over video or from speaking podiums or writing in books and speaking about spiritual experience without disclosing to you, the seeker, that they are suffering off camera every bit as much as any audience member. You know, I know one, and I'm not mentioning names because I'm not here to call anybody out personally. I could be called out. You know, I know one best-selling New Age author, household name. He wrote a book that was hugely popular, and the sales were sufficiently robust so that the book was all but guaranteed a spot on the New York Times bestseller list. New York Times bestsellers comes out, he's not on there. And he's furious because he feels, and I think with some justification, that there are cultural affinities that sometimes sneak into how bestseller lists are compiled. There are cultural affinities that sneak into just about everything. And he is a person who wouldn't be held necessarily in high esteem at an opinion-making institution like the New York Times. And there was probably some degree of cultural prejudice that kept him off the bestseller list. He knew what the numbers were, and he was angry. And I understand that. And he was perhaps more than angry. I think he was furious, and he was disappointed, and he was hurt, and he wanted to do something about it. But the experience that I'm describing to you is almost altogether absent from the books, the lectures, and the communications that emanate from this same person. If you go to one of his events or read one of his books, you'll hear things about trying to just observe your thoughts, trying to participate in non-attachment, non-identification, to realize that you're not a composite of achievements or things or titles. And I'm not entirely sure I agree with any of that, because I think we're way too quick to draw lines of demarcation between different areas of life. What's inner life? What's outer life? Where would one end and one begin? what's eternal, what's temporal. I mean, there's a lot of gray area in these things. So I'm not entirely sure I agree with that point. That'll be a subject of another evening. But what I am sure about is that it would be more valuable to the listener if the speaker was engaged in more of an exchange and was more self-disclosing about the fact that he, under moments of stress, is unable to abide by the very principles being described. That's important. That's important. Because when you start to get down to that kind of self-disclosure, it tells people, A, that they are not alone, that it's not as if me or someone else is more successful in some way at living a more presumably self-possessed dynamic life than my neighbor is, because that's not true. And B, it also helps open up the question of whether many of the principles that we talk about within the alternative spiritual culture, mindfulness, centering yourself, meaning, purpose, pursuit of non-attachment, non-identification, valuing what you can't see, all these things which are very familiar to all of us and can be cited by chapter and verse from all kinds of spiritual literature, ancient and modern, Eastern and Western, whether those things really serve to actualize change in the blunt everyday experience of the individual. And I mean the experience of Thursday at 2 p.m. Not when I'm seated on a meditation pillow. Not when I'm sitting in a chair reading a book and nodding my head and saying, right, I agree with that, absolutely. If agreement with principles made a difference, then the Beatitudes would change the world. Then the Bhagavad Gita would change the world. Then the meditations of Marcus Aurelius would change the world. Then the essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson would change the world. But they haven't changed the world. They haven't eliminated the predominance of grasping and spite, for example, in the very communities that would extol those works of literature. Just today, somebody sent me a 5-paragraph letter telling me, a reader, that I was too judgmental, with no irony whatsoever. So it's a question of whether the principles that we most often repeat, internalize, recite as if they are hallowed, unquestioned principles, as unquestioned as the Earth's revolution around the sun, really, truly serve us in the day-to-day hours of our lives in which we seek self-expression, sound relationships, livelihood, and some sense that we are living out the existence that we wish to be, some reasonable pursuit of happiness. And I want us to be very brave in asking these questions, because all of us here tonight, and we are all here as seekers, we've read the great works of spiritual literature, ancient and modern, Eastern and Western, and we may from time to time have fallen to our knees at the beauty and relevance and truth of what we've read. But as Eliot wrote, between the dreaming and the coming true falls the shadow. Something disrupts and gets in the way of those ideas being actionable. That's been my personal experience. That's been my observation. And I think it's fair to say that's been true more or less over the arc of human history. So my question for myself, for all of us tonight, is much more intimate. And that is, what does spiritual thought offer to the individual who is suffering? specifically from depression, from anxiety, or from something that might send us to therapy or psychopharmacology and to spirituality. What works and what hinders us? I will say the following before I start to get to some ideas that I think could be productive and helpful. There are some people among us who I believe are suffering from severe personality disorders or psychological maladies, all of which just means the incapacity to sustain normative relationships. That's all it means. I'm using these diagnostic terms. I'm just talking about the question of whether or not the individual can sustain happy relationships of some kind, at work, at home. You don't have to be a bon vivant, but we do live in relation to one another, and if the individual is incapable of maintaining relations that are not marked by emotional violence, then there's a very grave and serious problem. In my personal experience, and I'd be curious to hear from a number of you about this as well in our exchange at the end. In my personal experience, there are individuals who suffer so deeply emotionally, who are so incapable of maintaining normative, productive relationships that I don't necessarily think that the spiritual path as currently constructed is a good first recourse. Because I think that the spiritual path as practiced in the Western world and other parts of the world, of course, emphasizes experiences, emphasizes transcendent experiences. And people like to talk about these transcendent experiences. A vision that they had, or an incredible meditation session that they had, or some truth that came to them. But the fact is, these can be like looking at vacation photographs. Like somebody just scrolling through their phone saying, well, I went here, I went there. Are you there right now? Am I there right now? If I go up in an airplane and I have this wonderful perspective and I see land stretched out all around me, well, I land and I come back down to earth and I have my normal perspective. Yeah, that was an experience, but again, it doesn't necessarily affect me when I'm under terrible pressure. And the only time we really know a person, the only time we really know ourselves, if we're willing to look, is when we're under terrible pressure. When you've had a good meal, when you're dry, when you've had a glass of wine, when you're happy, well, we're all relatively good-humored in such circumstances. But the circumstances of grave stress, which many of us have felt over the past year, especially due to the lockdown, I think stress reveals character in as much as stress reveals the strength of an alloy. If somebody tells you this piece of steel or this piece of iron won't bend, well, it doesn't matter. You have no way of knowing that other than when it's under extreme conditions, other than when it's under stress. As above, so below. Why should my character be any different from a tree or a piece of alloy, the resilience of which isn't revealed without stress? So I think when people are either under extreme stress or when they have some sort of an emotional block that makes them incapable of dealing with stress, I'm not entirely sure that the spiritual path, first and foremost, is always helpful. Because again, the spiritual path emphasizes experiences too often, and experiences in practice. And experiences are very often fleeting. They don't change my internal weather system in any permanent way. That's why I don't really chase after experiences. When discussions at an event, come around to what wonderful mystical experiences people have had, I'm apt to just almost want to leave the room because, again, it's like sharing vacation photographs. What I'm interested in is how to deal with the depths of despair that we will refer to as depression, that we will refer to as anxiety, that we will refer to as a disorder. And what insights, if any, can be found on the spiritual path. And by spiritual, I mean extra-physical. That's my definition. I feel absolutely certain of the fact that we lead both physical and extra-physical lives. I won't go into any great defense of that right now, but suffice to say, not only do we have centuries of testimony from seekers like yourselves, but in the 20th and 21st century, we have scholarly psychological, scholarly psychical or ESP research, for example, which demonstrates the anomalous transfer of information in laboratory settings, which speaks to the fact that there is some non-local quality to intelligence. And we have fields, mainstream fields like neuroplasticity, whose findings are widely accepted, which demonstrates through brain scans that sustained thoughts will actually alter the neural pathways in your brain. It's mind over matter. Sustained thought over a period of time will actually alter the pathways through which electrical impulses travel in your brain. Thought alters gray matter. No one challenges the findings of neuroplasticity. The implications are another story. The implications are more radical than the findings are, but the implications are not often talked about. And there are other fields. Some of the most dramatic experiments in placebo studies demonstrate just the extraordinary efficacy of the mind to reorient the body, extending even to things like placebo surgeries. Ellen Langer, a psychologist at Harvard University, has done studies demonstrating that people will reverse age-related maladies or demonstrate weight loss or improved muscle mass just based on the information they're receiving or the settings or environments that they're in. It goes on, and I'm not even going to deal with any of the theoretical material from quantum theory. But the fact is, we have a conclusive case, I believe, in the 21st century that we do participate in a non-physical and extra-physical existence, which to me is spirituality. I was asked today, do you think we have a soul? I mean, I don't use the term soul, I use the term psyche, by which I mean an amalgam of intellect and emotion, and also that part of intellect that goes beyond the cognitive, that goes beyond motor function, that deals with, that relates to the extra physicality of existence. So when I say spirituality, I mean the extra physical. And I think that is one reason why it is so critically important for you, the seeker, and me, the seeker, to be in environments that are nurturing. Because I think when we speak in terms of, we use metaphors, vibrations, vibes, good energy, bad energy. Those metaphors get at something very real, I believe. And I think that if you find yourself in an environment where you feel bullied, or you feel misunderstood, or you feel put down, or you feel that you are the perpetual butt of someone's jokes or something of that nature, I take it as a spiritual principle that you owe it to yourself to get out of that environment and to sever those relationships as quickly and as completely as possible. Because I think that what we describe metaphorically as, again, good vibes, good energy, bad energy, whatever, I think it actually is a marker for something very real and very concrete, which we may not fully be able to understand in the here and now. But I think that you probably recognize from personal experience the depletion, the anxiety, the sense of almost physical assault that you feel yourself under when you are among people who profoundly misunderstand you or who disrespect you. William James, one of my true heroes, wrote in his letters in the late 19th century that he felt ultimately the greatest need in human life was the need to be appreciated. And he felt that he had overlooked that in his philosophy up until that point, the need to be appreciated. It's so simple, and yet it's so powerful. And sure, there are emotional examples, there are psychological examples that we could cite that support what I'm saying, but I'm taking it a step further. I'm suggesting that talk of energy fields or whatever, while it may be metaphorical, it describes something very, very real, just as we will describe physical sensations of heat or cold, using metaphorical language. If you believe in the spiritual path, if you believe in the extra-physical, then it stands to reason that what you're experiencing in day-to-day life has some component of non-local intelligence, or possibly some common intellect that we all participate in play at work. And it makes it profoundly difficult, even at moments of silence, even at moments without any visible sensory exchange, to be around people by whom you feel disrespected. I don't think either religion or psychology, religion or therapy, have done enough to address this point. I think too much emphasis within the spiritual world and within the therapeutic world gets put upon change from within. Again, what's within? What's without? Where would you specifically draw the line and make a cut? It's artifice to some extent. I mean, sure, it's necessary to generalize. It's necessary to talk about inner experience. And yet, isn't life really one whole? I just meditated an hour ago, okay? I practice transcendental meditation, something I personally recommend. You could say, sure, that's inner experience. I sat down, I crossed my legs, I sat on a cushion, I meditated. Yeah, I suppose that's inner experience in the most general terms. But it's also part of my outer life as well. It affects me physically, it affects me cognitively, it affects my motor functions. There's all kinds of things going on when I'm meditating. My legs get tired at a certain point. I come out of my meditation and I may be in a good mood. I may be in a bad mood. I may be, irritated because my neighbor was playing music. I may love my neighbor. There's any number of things going on. But the fact is, we're participating in a common life all the time. We use terms like inner, outer, within, without, higher, lower, because we have to speak in general terms in order to communicate with one another, just as we have to use metaphors in order to get things across to one another. And that's fine. But don't be so wed to it and don't be so married to it that we draw these stark lines of demarcation where they don't exist. I think there's a lot of people who go to see therapists who feel a sense of agony. And I don't know that therapist, and I'm not dumping on therapy. I participate in therapy. I'm just using that as an example. I could say, go to see a minister, go to see a spiritual counselor, whatever. And I think in such situations, in my experience, and in my experience dealing with other people, it's very, very, very uncommon that a guide or a therapist or a minister or a teacher or whomever will say, it's absolutely critical right now that you get yourself out of that situation. Of course, they would say it if there was physical abuse present, but I'm talking about emotional violence. Physical violence, of course, it's a given. I'm talking about emotional violence, situations where you're not respected, you're not understood, you're not appreciated, you're viewed as a threat, you're viewed as an outsider whose influence has to be boxed, categorized, and fixed. I think the solution is getting out of that situation as quickly as possible. Yes, if that situation repeats over and over, then you may have an issue to deal with, or you may not, quite frankly, or you may not. You know, the solution to a problem is in result. I mean, maybe you're the kind of person who only wants to be around certain types of people, and there's nothing wrong with that, and that shouldn't be pathologized. Maybe you feel things very deeply, and it's very important to you to be around people who are genteel. You can't always, but why shouldn't that be a goal? Why should you be the one who's classified as requiring a fixing? Maybe you're a loner. Maybe you don't want to go to the Christmas party. I mean, of course, now you don't have to. But my suggestion is that you may have preferences, and we pathologize preferences sometimes. Those preferences may be perfectly valid, and there's nothing about you that requires fixing. So, you know, sometimes my approach to questions of depression, anxiety, emotional disorder is to ask whether really this is just the individual is experiencing a frustrated sense of personal power, of self-agency, of self-exertion. And that frustrated sense of choice can be treated like a lifelong symptom, whereas it's not a symptom at all. It's selfhood. It's you. So I feel very strongly that you must get away from cruel people, and I also recognize that that's not always immediately possible. We sometimes have relationships where we're trapped financially, or we're trapped, or we feel like we are in terms of employment, or we're trapped because maybe we're the caregiver to somebody that we find absolutely obnoxious, and we feel trapped. And in that kind of a situation, I would first ask a question, just a question. Be absolutely certain that you really are trapped, and that that's not just a way of begging off consequences. You know, there's always consequences in life, in anything we do. If I sit by myself in a room, there's consequences. If I go out into the world, there's consequences. Whatever I stumble upon, whatever I do, whatever I express, whatever I participate in or abstain from, there are always going to be consequences. And if you're around somebody who's cruel and you say to yourself, I can't get away, just be careful. Be careful of the terms that you're using, because sometimes it's just a question of asking yourself, am I willing to shoulder the consequences of getting away? And the consequences may be too great. You know, the consequences just may be too great, but maybe they're not. And I just want you to feel the liberty, the personal liberty, to at least ask yourself that question. You know, it's not that you're trapped. I mean, you're not being physically held someplace, generally. You may have to face strong consequences. What will those consequences be? They may be financial. They may be deep disapproval from your community or from other family members. They may involve your physical safety. So you need to say to yourself, well, look, I'm not literally trapped, but I would face severe consequences if I were to separate from this person. So am I willing to sustain those consequences? That's a reasonable question. The answer may be yes. The answer may be no. And if the answer is no, and if you really feel that for financial reasons or reasons of shelter or reasons of safety or some other valid reason, you cannot get away from a cruel person, then I would ask you to make an internal vow to yourself, a vow that you are going to separate from that person as an internal fact immediately and do everything you can not to be subject to their moods, comments, whatever. Don't tell them what you're doing. The last thing you want to do is tell a cruel person that you found them out. They'll only turn it against you. You know what they'll say. You're being too defensive. You're being too sensitive, something like that. That's always the excuse that bullies use. I've never met a bully who doesn't, use that as his or her first line of defense. You're overreacting. You misunderstood me. You didn't misunderstand. Trust yourself. So if you can't get away, and don't tell the person that you're doing this, make an internal vow to separate from that person and to separate as a physical fact at the soonest possible opportunity. And that opportunity will come. If you are in earnest, that opportunity will come. And if you hold to that vow internally without telling the other individual, you will experience power. Because I do believe there are hidden tendrils of experience that bind us together. And it is only when you articulate what you're doing that you give the other person a psychological opening to speak or act against you. This is why a lot of esoteric schools teach that there's a special power in silence. I believe that's really true. You have a lot of power in silence, a lot of power that you may not be using. Never tell a cruel person that you found them out, because as soon as you do, you are capitulating to their playing field, their way of doing things, because they will have excuses and reasons as to why you're wrong. Their point of view is not important. Your well-being is what's important. Be silent, but be resolved. And I believe you will feel the accrual of power. You will feel that. I think a lot of what we pathologize is the frustration of personal power, by which I mean just the ability to see through one's reasonable plans and wishes in the world, and to do so with a sense of reciprocity. There's no reason to be afraid of using the word power. It doesn't mean amorality. It doesn't mean brutality. I would say power that's divorced from ethics is just force. And that's not power at all to me. Force is not renewable. Force is violent. Force is making other people do things. Power is self-expression. Power is an exercise of self. Power is reciprocal. Because of the very wholeness of life that I've been attempting to describe, it stands to reason that power only renews itself through reciprocity. Otherwise, it's force, which just gets quickly expended. So there's nothing amoral about power. Power is a circuit, so to speak, a circuit board. There's a connectivity. And again, this is why I'm referring to these things as spiritual. You could say, hey, well, get away from cruel people is good advice. And yes, it is, but it's more than just that. It's your life. It's your life. Because if we do lead an extra-physical existence, then the very proximity to people who don't appreciate you or disparage you is creating some sort of a unhappiness, which gets called depression or anxiety or something else. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't touch upon the biological causes of some of these things. We are all born with temperaments, and it's not always entirely clear what that is, but there's some aspect of our psyches that is clearly biologic. I have two sons, and I watch them come out of the womb with what seem to me fully formed personalities that have remained very much in place today, and they're both adolescents. I think it's not uncommon that the basic personality template that you witness in an infant will be, to a great extent, who that person is in middle age. You know, you'll see certain infants who are warm towards strangers, who light up when a stranger walks into the room. You'll see other infants, you know, a stranger walks into the room and they're frightened. We call it temperament, and we have some sense of perhaps what the biologic roots are of it, but we don't really know. I don't think we're a great deal closer to solving, or perhaps we'll ever solve, the so-called nature versus nurture debate. But the reason I raise this is because I feel very strongly that no one who's on the spiritual path should be made to feel that they are cheating or that they are bypassing somehow if they take a psychopharmacological substance or an SSRI. I think it's extremely, extremely important to understand that there is nothing contradictory, in my view, about pursuing medical options while at the same time pursuing your spiritual search. I mean, why would there be? I'm wearing glasses right now. What are glasses? Should I not be wearing glasses because that's not spiritual, you know? I'm nearsighted. It's the way it is. Reality may ultimately be consciousness. Reality may ultimately be mind. And I believe that's very likely true. And we'll do another evening and we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about the ideas of Neville Goddard and other figures who I love in the mind power tradition. But we experience many different laws and forces, including physical decline. If I get up and I bump my foot into the wall, I will experience pain as a fact. I will not say, well, there's no wall there. It's all just mind. That may be true in some ultimate sense, but that's not where I dwell. And we're all about, where do we dwell right now? Remember, it ain't about vacation photos. It's about, where am I right now? Where am I Tuesday afternoon at 2:30? Not what experience did I have once. So the fact is, you know, we use medical devices all the time. Is it unspiritual not to use crutches if you sprain your leg or something like that? You know, is it unspiritual to brush your teeth? You know, we do these things all the time. Why shouldn't you care for yourself psychologically through every possible means? Now, within the spiritual community, of some sectors of New Age culture, psychopharmacology has a bad rap. People feel like, oh, you know, these drugs get created to hook people and so on and so forth. And look, they have a point. I mean, there are big problems. The opioid crisis alone tells us that. There are huge problems in the way that drugs for profit get pushed on people. There's no question about that. But the fact is, we also can't be just entirely ideological about it. There are also many good things that psychopharmacological substances do. I take an SSRI. And it's very important to me to be frank and to be upfront about that. And I would like other people in the spiritual community, it's up to them, you know, it's up to the individual, but I would like other people in the spiritual community to be direct about such things, because I want to destigmatize these things, you know. And there are lots of drugs that may not always have great reputations, but that have helped people. I mean, I know people who, people who have suffered from ADHD and they take Ritalin, and it's made a great deal of difference in their lives. It's been a very positive experience for them. It's not for everybody. I'm not trying to suggest that, you know, this is the way to go. You know, it's a way. It's a way. I just want you, the individual seeker, to feel at liberty. You know, one of my friends is a guy named Norm Rosenthal, who is a professor of clinical psychiatry at Georgetown University. And I'm going to come back to say something about Norm and a study he did in just a little bit. But, you know, one of the things I really like about Norm is that he's a practicing psychiatrist. He prescribes meds to people when they're needed. And he also is a big advocate, as I am, of transcendental meditation. Norm is very deeply involved with the David Lynch Foundation. Now, you know, one of the things I like, personally speaking, about TM is that there's no division, there's no chasm between practicing TM and taking an SSRI or another psychopharmacological substance. I think it's very, very important to understand that. And I think, personally speaking, that's a good model. I just believe there are too many precincts of the spiritual culture, and I've felt it myself. I can assure you, I have felt these prejudices myself at times that depict taking a drug as cheating. And I just don't think that's true. I just don't think that's true. Again, am I cheating because I'm wearing eyeglasses? Is somebody cheating because he's using a hearing aid? Is somebody cheating because they're maybe receiving a pain medication after a surgery or something? Is surgery itself cheating? Of course not. You know, again, these lines are artificial. You know, we demarcate things too quickly and too readily. What's medical? You know, what's spiritual? Is it really easy to answer that question in an age where placebo studies are entering territory that was just unknown even a generation ago, where people are benefiting from transparent placebos, placebo surgeries, experiencing heightened effects of recognized treatments when they're given positive and correct information about the benefits of the treatments. The whole placebo field is begging questions today about the reaches of thought. And so to even talk about spiritual versus medical, you know, starts to get into some fuzzy territory. Obviously, there are differences. And again, we need to speak with one another. So we're going to have to rely upon generalizations. But generalizations are not weapons, you know, and they're not meant to divide us from things that might be helpful and might be effective. And my message to you is, you know, that I think we, as a human community, are under terrible stress, especially with the pandemic. And if there is something that is helping you that you want to experiment with, whether it's microdosing, whether it's MDMA, whether it is some other substance that promotes radical relaxation, I want you to be careful. I want you to be intelligent. I want you to be mature. I want you to do your homework. But I'm not going to tell anybody that they shouldn't experiment, because I think that one of the things we are in desperate need of in our culture today as well are what might be called accelerants. You know, people are in desperate straits. And if you can find something that serves as an accelerant that's not endangering you, and I trust most adults to do responsible research and to speak with professionals or to do something maybe under the care of a professional. But if you can find things that are accelerants, I would encourage you to embrace them. You know, I personally believe transcendental meditation is an accelerant. I speak of it only because it's what I have the most experience with. I've practiced Zen meditation and other forms of meditation, and I honor all such practices, but it just happens to be my personal commitment, and I find it extremely relaxing. Is it spiritual? Is it therapeutic? It's all these things. And it responds to just one test, and that is result. And that's something that you as the individual must determine. I also think that it's important to remember that if you're taking a multifaceted approach to your search, and this approach may include various spiritual modalities, may include various so-called medical modalities, like psychopharmacology, as I was just discussing. I think it's also important to understand that, and this is a delicate point, there's nothing wrong with wanting to feel a sense of victory as well, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of achievement, a sense of having gotten done that which you intended to get done. And I personally believe, and it's been a part of my search and the search that I've shared with others, that the direction of happiness does not always lie in detachment or seeking detachment from so-called outer or temporal life. It's been my personal experience that within the spiritual culture, we too often are deterred from speaking about victory, success, attainment, the seeing through of a project. None of that has to be interpreted in brutal terms. None of that has to be interpreted in this plainly material terms. Although there's nothing wrong with material terms either. We all have things that we wish to accomplish in this world. They may be intimate, they may be public, they may be artistic, they may be business related, they may be martial, whatever it is. We all have things that we wish to accomplish. And I would not take it off the table that if you feel a sense of despair, as we all do from time to time, you could be experiencing a very legitimate sense of deficit, frustration in terms of the pursuit or establishment of a project. And there is nothing wrong with that. That does not need to be fixed or diagnosed, in my view. I have seen people throw themselves into projects that have been extremely difficult. And there are a lot of people lining up saying to them, nothing is worth this. Don't put yourself through it. But boy, those moments of victory, when you experience something that you've been seeking to accomplish and to see through in the world, they're extraordinary. They can feel transcendent. They can feel elevating. And people say, oh, but the feeling is fleeting. Well, according to my chronicling of life, every feeling is fleeting. Everything changes. Life is like the seasons. If you want to know life, look out the window. Everything changes. Feelings of satisfaction, yes, of course, they change. They give way to something else. We're told that consumption only begets more consumption. Well, I understand that. And I understand how that can be problematic if it's driving a person into a cycle that's ruinous or self-destructive, like debt spending. But at the same time, it's also a growth principle. It's also a growth principle. If a bear eats salmon and then wants more salmon, does something have to be fixed? Is something wrong? Should the bear stop hunting for salmon? Of course not. It's just life. It's the cycles of life. We have things that we wish to accomplish, all of us. Intimate, public, whatever. Work-related, artistic, financial, relational, whatever. I don't think we should be afraid to acknowledge that to ourselves. I don't think we should be afraid of the wish for attainment. It doesn't mean it's always going to happen. It doesn't mean it's always going to happen. But I don't want spirituality to become a kind of decoy where we're talking ourselves out of the thing that we really want because it might not happen. I think that can create sorrow. I think that can create frustration. I have from time to time, I think, used spirituality myself that way as a kind of decoy. You know, the outer world is frustrating. The outer world is at times contentious, combative, difficult. We fear disappointment. We fear letting people down. We fear getting let down. So sometimes we talk as though we're aspiring to a higher set of values, but we may be using the spiritual path as a kind of a decoy. I'm not trying to present any of this in any manner of certainty, but these have been my observations, and I at least want us to be willing to consider these questions. Just consider these questions. I was interviewed some weeks ago by a newspaper in India about the gratitude movement here in the United States. And the reporter asked me, what would give people inner peace? I can only answer from personal experience, but I think for me, a sense of victory and attainment brings inner peace. It's kind of heterodox or verboten to say that. You know, there's people within the spiritual culture who probably think, oh boy, Horowitz has just gone off the rails. You know, he's confused the monopoly board for Jerusalem or whatever. You know, I just don't think it's that simple. I don't think we can draw simple, neat lines of demarcation. Western scripture says that the Creator fashioned the individual in its own image. Well, if you take that seriously, then doesn't it stand to reason that you, the individual, are inherently creative? That that's a fundamental part of who you are, broadly defined? Hermetic philosophy puts it differently, as above, so below. Doesn't it stand to reason that generativity, productivity, creativity is an essential foundation of life? Of course, that can become gross, just as consumption can become gross. Medicine and poison are the same. It all depends on the dosage. If we lock ourselves into ruinous cycles that are not returning anything to us, that are not making us more reciprocal beings, yes, that can be absolutely self-destructive. We see it with addiction. I mean, what is addiction other than an automatism? An internal bodily automatism. So anything, you know, can fit that pattern. And we have to be scrutinizing of ourselves for that. But I don't think that any of that dictates that we should avoid the question of whether attainment, achievement, victory, appreciation is what we're aiming for. You know, there's an old expression, no one ever dies, no one on his deathbed ever wishes he spent more time at the office. Well, it's a nice expression. I'm not entirely sure it's true, to be frank with you. It may not be the office, but it may be the woodworking studio, the martial arts map, the rehearsal room, the conservatory, the garden, whatever. You know, it may be that the individual finds a great deal of his or her self-expression in work and the exercise of self. I mentioned my friend Norm Rosenthal a little earlier in the presentation, and I want to return to a study that Norm performed with a colleague at Georgetown University that revealed something about depression that I found astonishing. And it has to do with the cosmetic treatment Botox. Don't jump ahead. don't jump ahead in terms of where you might think I'm going with this. Norm and a colleague of his, a cosmetic dermatologist, conducted a study several years ago. I think it was in 2014 at Georgetown University Medical School, where they found that Botox injections seemed to lift depression in people. And a number of dermatologists and physicians had made this observation informally and wondered why. Sure, the obvious answer is, well, people are perhaps, happier with their appearance if they get Botox, and that makes them less depressed. It doesn't exactly stand up. There's something else going on. So Norm and his colleagues structured a study where a group of subjects who suffered from chronic depression were given Botox injections. But the study was structured, as are most such clinical studies, with a control group. So one group of participants was given actual Botox injections. Another group was given just standard saline injections, just an inert substance. The group that received the Botox injections versus the placebo group, the control group, experienced 52% of the participants reported a considerable reduction in their depression versus a much, much smaller number, maybe it was about 5% in the control group receiving the saline solution. And you would think that people would be able to tell the difference between a Botox and saline, whatever it may say about the efficacy of Botox as a cosmetic treatment. People were not able to tell the difference. Most of the participants, not everyone, most of the participants were not able to tell the difference. And if they were able to tell the difference, it didn't have any effect in any case on their reported symptoms. So think of it. You've got a group of subjects. You've got a control group that's just given saline solution. You've got an active group of subjects who were given Botox injections. The group of subjects who were given Botox injections, who are suffering from depression, more than half of them report substantial relief. Why? Why would that be? Norm hypothesized that what was observed could be in support of something that William James, who I mentioned earlier, had observed in his work in the late 19th, early 20th century. And that is that the assumption of a mood in and of itself is generative of that mood. We tend to grow up with the opposite point of view. We tend to grow up with the point of view that the mood itself produces whatever the expression is. I feel angry, so I act out in some way. Well, perhaps not. Perhaps not. Perhaps it's the demonstration of the mood itself that reinforces what's thought to be the innate cause behind it. Here's the point. The way Botox works is that it freezes or it petrifies certain muscles in your face that are associated with wrinkles. That's the principle behind it. Those are the very same muscles that you use to frown. Botox as a treatment paralyzes the very muscle set in your face that you use to grimace. And you are using those muscles all the time, including when you sleep, including when you dream. And so the Georgetown study hypothesized that by freezing the very muscles that are used to grimace, to frown, it seemed to have an actual effect, a proportional effect on mood itself. Expression affected mood, versus mood affecting expression, which is the more normative way of looking at it. So it supports, I'm not suggesting that you should run out and get Botox treatment. Nor am I suggesting you shouldn't. I mean, I'm neutral on the question. But the important thing here is that it supports William James's observation that assuming the mood, assuming the very attributes that you wish to express, that you wish to demonstrate, itself instigates the mood, instigates the feeling. It's a fascinating prospect, and it's something to experiment with. And I think that's probably what the Botox study was revealing. There was no other physiological connection that anybody was able to come up with. And it was very well balanced with a control group and very carefully done. So it's a fascinating prospect that which we choose to give expression to is determinative, at least to some degree, of mood. This is the New Thought gospel. This is the New Thought gospel. This is the positive thinking gospel. As many of you know, I have a lot of love for that movement. I have a lot of love for the New Thought movement. I have a lot of love for the positive thinking movement. The reason I break with that movement in some ways is because I find that movement sometimes violative of some of the other things that we've been talking about, but it also has wonderful, wonderful insights. And one of them is that rather than circumstance giving birth to experience or mood, or it's actually the other way around. It's expression that gives birth to circumstance. And that's something I always want people to experiment with. Now, I say all that also understanding and realizing that sometimes pain is so acutely felt that the act of expressing its opposite is just not possible. And I have experienced that many, many times. There are many times where I've said to myself, you know, here I am, an enormous admirer of Neville Goddard. Here I am, someone who writes in the New Thought tradition, and I know I should be expressing something more positive, but I'm feeling a state of anguish, I'm feeling a state of anger, and I'm incapable of expressing what I would like to. That happens to all of us. It is a basic part of the human situation. So what to do? You know, are we kind of locked out of the temple gates at such points? I don't believe we are. Because I feel that if our thoughts are interconnected, if our thoughts have causative qualities, and there's no question that they do, based on a number of the things that we've been talking about. That being the case, I think the very awareness of that fact helps you to use your thoughts in the fullest possible way, including when you feel a sense of anguish and all you're capable of doing is expressing a desire to yourself, maybe to another, not to be in that state of anguish. It could be that the very realization of thought causation, and it is absolutely real, the data coming out of neuroplasticity alone tells us that, the very realization of thought causation should allow you to feel that your wishes, your clarified wishes, your clarified wants, your clarified desires are themselves a tool of change, of possibility. But one must be clear about it. If we're muddled, we sort of get nowhere. It's like driving a car around in a circle. I mean, why would physical life be different from mental life? in nature, we see that focus brings power. A photon of light is undetectable, but if you concentrate photons into a beam, it becomes a laser. Mist is something, water mist, you can move out of the way with your hand, but channel that water mist into a waterfall and it becomes irresistible force. Focus brings power. And why would that not be true of thought if it's true in the outer world, in the world that we observe and experience physically? Why would that not be the case? And I don't think, and I'm experimenting with this myself right now, and I invite you to experiment with it as well, if it's of interest to you. I don't think that harnessing the causative powers of thought are solely dependent upon being able to enter into the feeling state of satisfaction, because sometimes that's not possible to us. Sometimes that's not possible to us. And yet, if we are aware of, if we acknowledge that we understand today in the 21st century that thoughts have extraphysical properties, thoughts have causative properties, thoughts are a force. If we understand that, and we really grok to that, and I think there's good reason to, it could be that that realization alone is sufficient for us to understand that a clarified desire has power beyond just the cognitive, beyond motor skills. I mentioned earlier placebo studies that have been done using transparent placebos. One such study was done at Harvard University Medical School about 7 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. Researchers discovered that if subjects were administered a placebo transparently, if they were told they were being given an inert substance, a substantial number, I think it was about 59%, still reported considerable and lasting relief. And yet the whole basis of the placebo effect is supposed to be basically a benign deception. You're giving somebody an inert substance, a sugar pill, you're leading them to believe that that pill is some sort of a active substance, and we sit back and watch what happens. But in this case, people were transparently administered a placebo in the Harvard study, the transparent or the honest placebo study from about 7 years ago. The subjects involved were sufferers from irritable bowel syndrome, and 59% of them reported significant and lasting improvement, even though they were given a substance that they knew was inert. Is there possibly a connection here? Could we say that if we understand, if we accept the role of the mind as an agent of change, as an agent of force, that knowledge alone could enhance our capacity to use it in whatever state we find ourselves in? This is something I want us to experiment with. This is something I want us to consider. And this is very important to me because so many of us, myself included, find ourselves in positions where we are unable to assume the feeling state that is supposed to be the royal road to deliverance, within the New Thought paradigm. But is it possible that that feeling state is not always necessary if we understand our innate capacities as physical and extra-physical beings? That's something I want us to experiment with. I feel that there are tools on the spiritual path that can be and should be freely mixed. I don't think that there's any one kind of prayer that a person needs to participate in. And I think if you're suffering from depression or anxiety or something that is causing you acute emotional pain, prayer is a very valid option. And prayer of any kind. You know, there's all kinds of, if one wants to be scripturally based, there's all kinds of examples of prayer in the Old and New Testament. You know, the kind that gets talked about often is the kind that is affirmed in the Gospels, which is to pray with the feeling that you have already received, and in that faith, so will you receive. And there's precedent for that in Scripture. It's also precedent for a lot of other forms of prayer in which the matriarchs and patriarchs strike bargains with God, get angry, make demands. After Cain slays his brother Abel, he's told that he's going to have to wander the earth as a nomad. And Cain actually argues back and says, if this occurs, then I'm going to be killed by the first person who happens upon me. If I wander the earth as a nomad, I'll be defenseless and my life will be taken from me. And so in Scripture, God says, okay, and he amends the punishment and puts a mark on Cain, the so-called mark of Cain, which indicates that anybody who lays a hand on this person will suffer retribution many times over. So there's all kinds of examples of prayer in Scripture. And your prayer doesn't have to be limited to scriptural examples, although there are plenty of them. I believe that our ancient ancestors had a much deeper and much more urgent relationship with nature than we do. They lived and died by the cycles of planting. I mean, we do too, but we just don't know it. We're sort of insulated from it. But I believe that our ancient ancestors across many different cultures identified energies within nature, personified these things, giving them names like Set or Zeus or Minerva, and they formed petitionary relationships with these deified energies. I think that's a completely legitimate form of prayer. And I think if you identify a deity from the pantheon of gods that you feel sympathy with, that you identify with, and you choose to forge a relationship with that deity, that can be extremely powerful. And I think that's a very, very legitimate form of prayer. And it's something that I experiment with myself a great deal. So I guess what I'm really trying to say to you ultimately is that problems often have a complexity of causes. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to avail ourselves of a complexity of solutions. I think too often we are trained to think in terms of getting to the antecedent of a particular problem or of a particular difficulty. You know, let's peel back the onion and get to the root cause. Why do I behave this way? Why do I engage in this repetitive, depleting act, whatever it is? You know, and in searching for a root cause, I think we sometimes paint ourselves into a corner because there can be a whole complexity of causes. There may be many, many different reasons why a person behaves in ways that are destructive, including the possibility that he or she enjoys behaving that way, which should never be neglected. That's sort of something that we rarely like to face up to, but we really ought to, because we are self-driven beings, and when people engage in the same kind of behavior over and over, even if it seems destructive, or even if they say to themselves, why do I do this? It's worth scrutinizing whether you or I are enjoying it. People enjoy arguing. They enjoy fighting. They enjoy conflict. We don't always want what we say we want. I remember years ago, I knew a woman who said that more than anything else, She wanted a steady boyfriend. She wanted to be in a relationship. And I recall that she would go on date after date after date with all these inappropriate men. And then, on Monday would tell a story about this crazy guy did this thing and this crazy guy did that thing. And when I heard enough of these stories, I thought to myself, wait a minute. This person is saying that she wants to be in a steady, stable relationship, but she keeps going out with all these inappropriate guys and then telling stories about the crazy things that they did. Maybe she doesn't want to be in a relationship at all. Maybe it's the avoidance of a relationship. We just really have to look at our actions and ask ourselves, what am I getting out of this? We enjoy anger sometimes. Strange as it may sound, we enjoy anxiety sometimes. There's a certain drama in it. There's a certain conflict in it that may be exciting, that may make us feel vivified in some way. Watch yourself very, very carefully. Never exclude the possibility that the thing that you're describing as a problem may be self-reinforced because you're enjoying it on some scale. It sounds strange, but we like getting scared. We like going to horror movies. We like riding the roller coaster. We like riding, into the scary house at the carnival. There's many different reasons for that, but the fact is, a thrill can come from strange quarters and strange places, and sometimes behaviors that we describe to ourselves as problematic or dangerous or depleting may have some payoff that we're not acknowledging. And we have to acknowledge that payoff and ask ourselves whether the consequences are up to the level of what we're actually enjoying. But my point is that because a problem may have a complexity of causes, you should be willing to avail yourselves of a complexity of solutions. I don't want you to feel that any one path, spiritual or otherwise, is the right path. The right path is the one that nets results. The right path is the one that accelerates. And I also want to say, in a closing point before we go to our exchange, because I know there's a lot of people who have things to offer and I'm eager to hear them. I also want to say that sometimes the things that we describe as a problem or a pathology is no such thing. I was alluding to this earlier when I said, if you're in the wrong company, you may be suffering terribly. But then when you find yourself in the right company, you suddenly rediscover yourself as a person of equanimity, good humor, relaxation, somebody who enjoys being around other people. Yes, you enjoy being around other people with whom you're in sympathy, with whom from whom you feel appreciation. It may just be that sometimes some problems are environmental, circumstantial, situational. And it also may be that certain things that you experience about yourself that you are led to feel are problematic or diagnosable are just a fact of life. I mentioned earlier the trickiness of using language like I suffer from X. I said I've never really experienced depression, but I do experience anxiety, and that's been a lifelong fact for me. But just very recently, I've asked myself, just over the past week or so, is that really a problem? Is it a problem that the rays of the sun are hot? Is it a problem that the waters of the Pacific are warm? Is it a problem that glacial waters are cold? There's a certain makeup to all of us that's as intrinsic as eye color. Anxiety has actually created in me a great deal of vigilance. Anxiety has helped me to avert problems for myself and for other people. Anxiety has led me to create backup plans. And yes, anxiety also causes me sometimes to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, or to catastrophize, or to think to myself, oh, this is going to be so difficult, whereas it's not difficult at all. And that can be painful at times. But to be perfectly frank with you, at age 55, although I would say I experienced tremendous satisfaction in my life, and I'm much happier today, for example, than I was, say, 10 years ago, I don't think that that sort of beacon signal of anxiety has ever left me. And I question at this point on my path whether I should be describing that as a malady at all. Look at the pantheon of gods from any culture you choose: Vedic culture, Egyptian culture, Polynesian culture, Greek or Roman culture. The gods are as varied as human experience itself. There are gods who embody jealousy. There are gods who embody fear. There are gods who embody anxiety. There are gods who embody love. There are gods who embody spite. There are gods who embody generosity, teaching, wisdom, warfare. You may want to form a relationship with one of these deified energies. It may help you to come into a sense of acceptance of a trait that may be as natural to you as it is to the bee to gather pollen, as it is to the cat to hiss at danger, as it is for the bear to hunt salmon. Why would we be different? Obviously, if traits become ruinous, by which I mean they really deplete our relationships or our capacity for livelihood, then we do face a crisis. But I would say that every trait that we rush to label as something requiring of fixing may just be an entirely natural state for you. And that natural state may at times bring difficulties. But where have we ever been told that life is not going to be possessed of difficulties? Life is not going to be possessed of consequences. And I think this brings us a little closer to the exercise of personal power. And again, by power, I don't mean force. Power, in its true sense, is reciprocal. It recognizes connectivity because that's the only way it gets renewed. A true sense of power, to me, is self-expressiveness. And self-expressiveness may at times require accepting traits in yourself that don't necessarily have to be classified as crises or as things that are diagnosable or as things that require fixing. The only thing required of you, I believe, to experience happiness is a fuller sense of self-expressiveness, a fuller sense of fully occupying yourself and of experiencing the capacity to go through life with a sense of agency, to create, to produce, to generate. Again, as above, so below. That, for me, at this stage of my search, is the spiritual path. A search for life in all its dimensions, physical and extra-physical, relational and reciprocal. And when we approach spirituality, as many of us do, with a wish to feel relief from depression and anxiety, if that's what we wish, I want us to be able to open ourselves to the fullest range of questions that will not only accelerate and deliver us to solutions, but questions that may make us reconsider whether there is any problem there to begin with. And so I thank you all very deeply. I feel very privileged to have been able to share this exchange with you tonight. And we certainly do have time in front of us. We have about 25 minutes or so for questions, comments, exchanges. And I'd like to open up the floor, open up the mic so that we can all hear from one another. Thank you.
Mitch, I do want to ask you, one thing that, this is just a personal observation. I may be totally off. So if I am, please tell me. But I think that people, many people that suffer from depression, anxiety, feel the weight of the world on their shoulders, those people tend to be very empathic. And so they take on a lot of the burdens or luggage that other people have, and they're experiencing that for themselves, and maybe it doesn't even apply to them. It's just that empathic power or ability that kind of does that.
Yes, I think that's very true, and I think that gets at the point of a lot of what I've been trying to express. I think that people who feel emotions, sympathies, antipathies very deeply, they probably do have a very deep sense of their surroundings, their environment, not only in terms of emotional receptivity, but possibly in terms of something greater, some kind of intuitive or psychical receptivity. I think that's a very, very real thing. And again, you know, we talk in terms of energies and good vibes or bad vibes or whatever, but those are markers for something that I believe are very, very real. And I think that the extremely sensitive person needs to take care to protect his or her psyche. And I take that very, very seriously. And I think that everybody listening, if you feel that that describes you, you are wholly and entirely within your rights to protect your psyche in any way that you see fit.
Fantastic. Does anyone have any questions for Mitch? Please feel free to unmute yourself. I see Clint, you have your hand raised. Go right ahead.
Hey, excellent presentation, Mitch. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'll open up a little bit and go with this. Let me fix my screen if you don't mind. So I was on SSRIs for a while. I had a condition, we'll call it, that presented itself in my early 20s, and that was rough to get through. But student of psychology, read all about Carl Jung, as much as I could. Learned about the collective consciousness. I think I wrote it down here, non-local intelligence. I'm assuming that's roughly the same thought pattern there.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it interrelates for sure, yeah.
A thought I had back then that really helped me just kind of be at peace, and if it's not true, don't tell me, because it's kind of a personal belief of mine now. But people thinking and having good thoughts about other people really get added to this collective unconsciousness and this collective consciousness and this non-local intelligence, and it helps. Whether you know it or not, whether they tell you or not, it helps.
I agree.
And I think the same can be, I was going to ask you, can the same be true the other way? If you're not on people's minds, if people don't have a thought about you, does that affect your overall level of depression, your mood, your outlook on life as that goes about?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, what you just described may be the definition of loneliness. You know, people may feel lonely simply because they're not in a kind of feeling of comportment or concert with other people. You know, loneliness may actually be defined by what you just described, this feeling that others are not thinking of me, and it may be a feeling in a very literal sense. One could also ask, what are the effects of having negative thoughts about another person? And these are dicey questions, because there's all kinds of relationships and reciprocities. And I'm not personally speaking of the school that says don't ever walk around with a negative thought about another person. I think that sometimes retributive thoughts are part of life. They're part of nature, and what we do with those thoughts and how we act and how we comport ourselves in the world, both in private and in public, matters very deeply. But I don't know that there's just any one single way to be an ethical being. And I, aside from my very deep belief in reciprocity and human wholeness, I don't know that there's any one way to be, so I tend not to approach life from the perspective of, always necessarily having rosy thoughts about another person, because sometimes there may be things that are conflictual, that are very real and very actual, and they have to be digested and dealt with and resolved in ways that are personally satisfying and ethically supportable. But I agree 100%. I feel what you're saying is absolute fact. That thoughts held by or about others are a force, and so if a person is holding positive thoughts or no thoughts whatsoever, I think that absolutely must have an effect.
All right, thank you, Mitch. Does anyone else have a question or comment for Mitch? Mitch, I'll say this real quick. I have a very, very dear friend who's on this presentation with us tonight, attending. And I'm not going to call him out unless he wants to speak for himself, but he did mention to me privately offline that he felt like you were speaking directly to him tonight. You were just really hitting on all of his questions and things that he was considering. So I hope he does ask some questions, but
Appreciate that.
We'll see. But I'm sorry. Does someone else have a question for Mitch?
I've got a question for Mitch. Hi, Mitch. It's Darcy.
Oh, hey.
Hey. My brain is still formulating a lot of what you're talking. I've been taking notes over here. And one of the things that I'm thinking about in all of this is get away from cruel people is such a simple but profound concept. And thinking about that lack of transparency with spiritual leaders, people that people look to.
Yeah.
Which then creates this cycle of them forcing their lack of transparency into their legacy of practice. People look at that legacy of practice and go, oh, see, they're almost like a deity. And I am constantly found lacking, which is what kills me about so many practices telling us how lacking we are. You're not digging deep enough. You're not meditating hard enough. You're not praying hard enough.
Right.
And so then you go back to them and it becomes this cycle of control.
Yes.
But then when you have these other people that buy into the cycle of control, then you find yourself lacking even more. Oh, I am not as good as them, even though they may be in, as you were talking about, the decoy stage. Like they're pretending like, oh, no, I'm doing it.
Right.
I wanted to hear your thoughts on, as we work to break out of those cycles and to get away from cruel people, how to deal with the social death aspect of that. Because it is one to break personally from cruel people. It is another thing to break from community in that and find yourself, as Clint was kind of talking about, like out in the wilderness.
Yeah. There's so much to unpack there, and I really appreciate that very deeply. So let me try to take this in a certain order. I think, first of all, you're absolutely correct that the guru, the teacher, the minister, the therapist, whomever, very often presents him or herself as the man with the plan, you know, and there's a theatrical aspect to this. And I know it because I've witnessed it, you know, from both sides of the table. You know, sometimes people will come to me and they'll think like, well, you know, he's got the recipe. What do I do? Do I add more salt? Do I add more chili pepper? You know, and it's, you know, there's a theater involved in seeing a minister. There's a theater involved in seeing a therapist or a guru or whomever, and it must be watched for. And this person, you know, very frequently wants something from you, you know, and very often what they want involves a certain degree of fealty. And it may not always be bad. I mean, you know, to keep the lights on at an ashram or at a church, you know, you need members. I mean, you know, somebody has to pay the electric bill. And so I understand that. But there is a theater that goes on in most of these relationships. And the most pernicious part of that theater can come from the other, you know, so-called acolytes who are saying, you know, hey, get with the program, because there's a great deal of self-flattery within spiritual cultures. If people deify the guru, or if they raise the guru up on a pedestal of some sort, what does it make them? It makes them an apostle. So then they're something very special themselves. And I know, you know, I run into this sometimes. I'll speak about like this or that spiritual teacher, and I'll say something that is seen as overly critical of that person, even though I may be making what I regard as a very, very mild comment. And, you know, people will come to me and they'll say things like, well, you know, you can't always understand the motives of a realized man. And I reject that. You know, I think at sensitive moments we can understand all kinds of things. And I think that becomes a very unexamined, very self-deceiving, but also very self-serving position, because the person who's elevating the teacher, again, you know, is a kind of evangelist or an apostle to the teacher. So people deputize themselves all the time by extolling the guru, because then, you know, well, they're hot stuff because they're, you know, in the #1 student circle, or, you know, whatever it may be. And it seems to me that all organizations, you know, hold out goodies to us. And if you want FaceTime with the big teacher, then you do things for the big teacher. And doing things for the big teacher might also mean telling other people they're out of line if they, you know, say something critical, you know, or what have you. So I think those concerns, you know, they're very rampant and they're very, very real. And then I guess it all just comes down to whether one wants to be part of a given community or a congregational model. I tend to find my relationships individually and one-on-one. I realized at a certain point in my 30s that I really wasn't into congregational spirituality. You know, I knew that at a certain point where, you know, when I heard, you know, and now turn to page 21, and, you know, I would just be thinking about where am I eating lunch after services. And then I did come to realize through different experiences that I personally don't really grok to congregations. So for me personally, not being part of community has been okay. You know, it's really been okay. For other people, it may be very important to be in a community, and I recognize that congregations or communities definitely do serve needs. And they're also important because sometimes they serve as incubators for practices or ideas that might really benefit from a community experimenting with something, trying something. I don't think one should ever fear exiting a community, because another will be found, and it may be another community that's more supportive of what you need. You know, there do need to be, you know, generally speaking, people in charge of things. I mean, you get on a bus and there's one bus driver, and, you know, we accept that. I mean, there's a certain degree to which people need to be in charge of things, and that's true in the spiritual or the therapeutic realm. But I do think it's profoundly important to recognize that there is a certain degree of theatricality that's always present. There is a certain degree of reward that's given or that's withheld to the loyal, and that's always present. You know, it's just human nature. But I think it's also really important to understand that we are entitled to to hold a spiritual teacher accountable in terms of whether that individual addresses our own needs. And in that vein, I want to tell a very, very brief story that was told to me by a teacher of mine who I very, very deeply loved. And he told me the story that in New York City, back in the, oh man, it must go back to like the early 1960s, there was a certain guru who was visiting, and he felt that this particular guru, who is from the Vedic tradition, was a realized man. I'm not personally sure I believe in that concept, but that was his experience. And he felt that being around this person was really, really something special. And this group of people around this guru had a meeting space on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And it's still there. And in this meeting space, at that time, there was no furniture. And everybody was concerned about, all right, we have to get some benches, we have to get some furniture. And this teacher gave my friend a holy book to borrow. And because there was no furniture, my friend had no place to put the holy book down. So he put it down on top of his shoes. Everybody had to remove their shoes, and he put the book on top of his shoes so that he could hold it there and take it home later. And the teacher saw this, and he was outraged. And he said, you obviously don't know how to treat sacred literature, so you're to give that book back to me. Now, in the Vedic tradition, shoes are considered very unclean. So unbeknownst to my friend, putting the book on top of his shoes was considered an offense. But rather than feel crushed by that experience, rather than feel humiliated by that experience, he said to me in a very matter-of-fact way, I realized at this moment that this man could not be my teacher because he could not see me. I would never disrespect a sacred book, but he was unable to see that in me. So even though I viewed him as a realized person, I knew that I would have to go somewhere else. And I thought, bravo, bravo. Rather than feeling chastened, you should be asking, does this teacher see who I am as an individual? So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question if you are taking more questions, Mitch.
Please.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. And thank you
Thank
for
you.
your incredible presentation as always. And
Thank you.
For sharing personal things. And this might piggyback quite well on Darcy's question.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in and around consciousness-based communities for 26 years. I went to like a New Thought kind of boarding school.
Oh.
Kind of tantric Taoist kind of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a TMer of 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
However, TM has increasingly made my anxiety worse. And I've been to every teacher in New York and LA. I'm just de-stressing, I'm de-stressing, I'm de-stressing. And that's the ceiling.
Yes.
What I can get out of explanation. And I'm perhaps maybe need to give it up because it sucks, but it also gives me greatness too.
Yes.
And I'm torn, and I'm wondering if you had any experience or knowledge about that you could share.
I really appreciate you bringing that up. And actually, someone who's very special in my life has described the exact same thing to me. So you are not alone. And I know it's tough because, you go to different people, different teachers, and you start to feel like you're getting one of the same, 6 or 7 answers. And it can be very frustrating, and it's always turned back on you, the individual seeker. It's like, well, you must be doing something wrong, And I know that can feel frustrating. The fact is, all these things, in my point of view, are very individualized. I know that people like to speak in terms of laws, and people like to speak in terms of absolute outcomes. I love TM. I'm dedicated to TM. I recommend it. But I have gone through periods where I have not practiced. I'm not precisely sure why, but there have just been times in my life where my practice has lapsed. And then there have been times in my life, including quite recently, probably COVID related, where I felt a lot of stress. And I returned to my practice, and I'm glad I did. And I really, really value it. But I will never allow that to trump someone else's individual experience, and your individual experience is absolutely what matters. Your physiology, your needs as a person, they must be honored. And I think all these things are highly individualized. Somebody may sit, in a mantra-based meditation and have, a good experience. Another person may sit and also have a good experience, but it may be a very different kind of experience, and then another person may not have any experience or may undergo anxiety. We don't know why that is, but William Blake put it best. He said, one law for the lion and the ox is oppression. So I think you should follow the dictates of your needs.
I see, Brandon, you have your hand raised, so please feel free to jump right in.
I do. Hello, everyone. Greetings,
Hey.
Paul, Mitch.
Hey, Brandon.
Matt, thanks for hosting. Fraternal greetings. John Lejeune, number 350, Quantico, Virginia. I appreciate you guys hosting this. Mitch, outstanding as usual.
Thank you.
I have personally let me turn that on. There we go. Hi, everyone. Personally found a great deal of healing in the Eastern traditions, mainly. Having, without giving you the whole backstory, but I'm a combat veteran and I dealt with a lot of difficult things, as a lot of people have.
Yeah.
And I've abandoned pretty much all hope in the Western traditions. As it seems that the Western model is focusing more so on the things to be accepted, whereas the East focus on acceptance itself. Broadly speaking, but I found much more healing in that regard. But I wanted to ask you to that point. First of all, if you're familiar with, I'm sure you are, Chogyam Trungpa, if I'm saying that correctly, but have you considered the parallels, if any, in what Trungpa described as spiritual materialism and what could very well be sort of an unmasked psychological materialism here, in the broadly speaking in the Western world, as a manifestation of the ego, so to speak. I've seen it, even, for example, in the Masonic community. There's a great deal of what I would describe as Masonic materialism.
Yes.
Seems like sometimes the ones with the most bumper stickers are the least Masonic. Or
right on.
If you have like whoever has the most mandala stickers or namaste stickers, that's often could be inversely proportional to their state of their spiritual well-being. But I just wanted to sort of beg your thoughts on had you considered parallels between the psychological and the spiritual materialism world.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I appreciate that question very, very much. And they're so similar, I mean, and it in many ways it gets to the point that Darcy was raising. I mean, human nature is so consistent. We like reward systems, and we enter a situation, whether it's a workplace, whether it's an ashram, whatever it is, whether it's a Masonic lodge, and knowingly or not, we hone in very, very quickly on, who's in charge, who's got the goodies, who signs the vacation slips, who hands out the pay raises, who hands out the cookies, and then we do whatever is necessary to get those cookies. And it's just human nature. It's just human nature all the way. And I think, there's a statement in the Talmud, although it probably appears in every religious and ethical tradition, beware the person who bespeaks his own virtue. I can't imagine there's a single religion or ethical tradition that doesn't have that statement at its heart, and that also doesn't have the guy who hits you over the head with a baseball bat because he thinks you violated it while he's teaching you how to be virtuous. So I think that it's a universal human problem. It's a universal human situation, and yet here's the funny thing, like it can also, like what you're describing, the dynamic that you're describing, it can also come out in these opposite ways, like these excessive displays of humility or something, that might be unnecessary or inappropriate. There was a story once that was told by a guy who ran a prison ministry. And he had written several books, and he went around and he visited prisoners as part of counseling programs. And so he told a story, and I really love this story. I love it. He told a story where one day he went to a prison and he met an inmate, and the guy said to him, "Wow, I cannot believe I am meeting you. I've read all your books. I think you're absolutely terrific. I can't believe, like here you are." And the teacher said to him, hey, it's not about me. It's not about, meeting me. It's about the work that we're all doing together. And then he said later, he felt really badly about having given that response to the man, because if this guy is experiencing some joy at meeting an author whose books that he's read, why should that be taken away from him? Why should he be corrected? Here's a man who's an inmate in a prison. He has very limited contact with the outer world. An author comes to visit, and the guy's thrilled at meeting him, and the author corrects him. Hey, it's not about me. It's about the message, man. And he rightly, and I thought beautifully, felt remorse about that later, because he felt that he corrected this guy. And that to me is like a form of spiritual materialism. He, instead of just letting this guy have his moment of joy, he's getting pious with him. And there's nothing positive, it seems to me, about that. But I applaud this man because he shared this story, and that's what I want us all to be doing more of.
That makes perfect sense. And thank you for that.
Thank you.
It leads me to be quite concerned about the moment that commerce enters the picture of treatment and of therapy.
Yeah, and it's part of life, it's part of life. And it requires balance. Of course, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with commerce, and religion and money have always had a tough relationship. Part of Sigmund Freud's genius was that he created a paradigm of the therapist as a medical professional whose billing and whose treatment was subject to a very clear exchange. And so, it kind of, in a certain way, dispelled or demystified, the role of money in psychotherapy as he conceived of it. But within the spiritual community, there has always been this very, very tough relationship. In fact, I think what I'm going to say to Matt, if he'll agree, is that maybe our next presentation should be a discussion of spirituality and money, because commerce is a basic part of life. The search is a basic part of life, and the two do not coexist easily. And we should do some digging there.
Absolutely. I love that idea.
Let's do it. Okay.
And Mitch, I know we're going late, but do you have time for just two more questions?
Yes, of course.
Okay, great. I'd love to call on my good dear friend Matthew, who's been waiting patiently, and he's been chatting with me offline. Just really has been, I think, impacted by your presentation tonight. So Matthew, if you'd like to ask your question or make your comment to Mitch, please go right ahead. Not sure.
Not hearing him. That's okay.
Oh no.
Could put it in the chat
try
box.
again. We can barely hear you.
1 second.
I heard that.
Okay. So now I'm online.
I hear you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation and all that you do. Matt has said
Thank you.
nothing but wonderful things.
Thank you.
And it dovetails nicely with part of my upbringing, which involved Lilydale, and
Oh, no kidding. Wow.
as
Very
of late,
interesting.
oh,
Wow.
I love Lilydale.
That's the
As of-
spiritualist community in upstate New York. For those who don't know, Lilydale, it's one of the, maybe the oldest continuous spiritualist community in the United States.
And I've been listening to Abraham Hicks a lot as of late,
Mhm.
and I'm relatively a baby to meditation.
Mhm.
I started that a year and a half ago, roughly, and it's been like cartilage in my emotional joints.
Mhm. Mhm.
Where I have a question, as tonight's presentation regarded depression,
Mhm.
what about, and you may not have an answer, it might be insight or experience. If somebody succumbs to their depressive episodes, if somebody finds that release in death,
Mhm.
self-inflicted,
Mhm. Mhm.
are they given that release? Are they given the same blessing of croaking, as Abraham Hicks would put it?
Mhm.
Or are they deprived of that release?
Mhm. Well, I mean, one has no way of knowing. I don't even know. I was saying to somebody earlier today, that we have an extra physical existence, I have no doubt. But what that means, apropos of death, whether something survives death in some individual way, none among us can possibly know. I do know that many, many, many years ago, for various reasons, I rejected any idea of a vengeful God, or a vengeful creator, which I think is so antithetical to the generative nature of life that I can't fathom that captures reality if we understand the purpose of life as generativity, creativity, productivity, which also involves cycles of demise and physical decline. But I can't fathom it. I do think William James wrote a wonderful essay in 1895 called "Is Life Worth Living?" And at that time, for some strange reason that nobody has ever really understood, in the mid-1890s here in the US, there was a very large spate of suicides among young men. A lot of young men were committing suicide. And so James addressed the question of suicide in this essay. And, one of the things he said is, look, you do possess a sense of self-agency. It is true. You can take your life at any time. But let that knowledge give you the power that you also have a certain choice. You can choose to end your life. But, and James, and this point, it can sound so simple, and yet it's very, very important, it seems to me. He said, knowing that you have that choice, knowing that is in your hands, can you stand it? Can you stand it just 24 hours more? Just 24 hours more. Just ask yourself that question. Because inasmuch as life visits catastrophes upon us, and it does, it also visits absurd good news on us. It does. Inasmuch as catastrophes occur, nobody would contest that, just extraordinary, unexpected pieces of good news occur, in the life of the individual. So knowing that you do have the agency to take your life, you also have the agency to just wait 24 hours and see, just see what the news will bring. It's not a vain hope. It's not a vain hope, because life goes in these wild cycles. And it's not uncommon that tragedy can be followed by joy. Life is rhythmic. It's a little different from the point that you were making, but I just wanted to add that. And if people want to read about James's essay, Is Life Worth Living? I wrote an article called "The Suicide Craze," which is published at Medium. And in that article, I talk about James's views on suicide and glean a number of points from that essay of his, Is Life Worth Living? So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. That's hit the nail on the head. Thank you very much.
Good, thanks.
And Carol, you've had your hand raised, so we don't want to skip over you. Please jump right in.
Hi, Mitch.
Hi, Carol.
My question is, I have a college-age daughter that is dealing with some of these things, depression, and she actually just came out to us, and I did not know about either one of the things. And so what has happened is she was a kid that was a double major, had a minor, just had all kinds of balls in the air.
Uh-huh.
And now is kind of stepping back,
Mm-hmm.
and her professors are all like, take as much time as you need,
Mm-hmm.
So we're obviously very supportive of, her coming out and her sexuality and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But, I know one of your philosophies is kind of being engaged and being passionate about things is part of kind of happiness.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like this, walking this fine line of like, okay, if she was too stressed, because I think she felt like there was too much she was dealing with, coming out, all the school stuff, the isolation, on teenagers. She's actually, in college, but just this COVID stuff is hard on them.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's, there was more isolation. And because even now she's home and I'll hug her, every night, and she's like craving it because at school she wasn't getting,
I can imagine.
basic,
Yeah.
human
Yeah.
connection kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of like, I'll be like, what's your schedule? And, kids home from college or, and so kind of, like I said, walking that line of not pushing too much, but also realizing engagement is part of happiness.
Yes, I agree. I don't think we as individuals can be truly happy unless we're productive. I think that lack of productivity absolutely gnaws at us. And it's funny, I have 2 adolescent sons, and whenever I'm asked parenting advice, I'm always reminded of a line that's often attributed to Napoleon. I don't think it was Napoleon who actually said it. I think it was a Prussian field marshal. Every plan immediately fails upon contact with the enemy. You'll excuse the metaphor, but that's sort of how parenting is. Whatever brilliant thing I think I've come up with, completely backfires. I think that I would probably say that, it is a time of such difficulty for us as a human community with COVID. She's coming out, she's isolated, she's worked hard at college. Our society, I don't think anybody could say that we've done a good job, handling this pandemic. I don't know how history is going to judge us, but we're sort of stumbling in the dark without any precedent. Probably there is a certain period where, it's okay if somebody wants to coast, or just enter a kind of fallow period. I mean, the soil does it too during winter. I'd get concerned, if come spring, literally, that fallow period doesn't live. But I think it's probably best to, just speaking, person to person, parent to parent, probably there are times where allowing the soil to just sit is probably okay, just as we see in nature.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I hope that's helpful. Yeah. Wow, well, thank you all so much.
Mitch, thank you. That has just been so
Thank you.
insightful and informative.
Thank you.
I think it's given us all something to really meditate on, to really think about, to address our own inner demons or issues, or dealing with anxiety and depression. You've touched on a lot of different topics that I think have really sparked a lot of interest and curiosity in people, or wanting to look into other issues. I think the response to tonight's presentation has been overwhelming.
Appreciate it.
you know, so I really, really do appreciate that. And I am all for our next presentation being about spirituality and capitalism. That's a fantastic idea. I love it.
We're going to do it. We're going to do it.
Let's put it together. Let's do it.
That's great. I'll email you in the morning. So
please do.
Yeah, watch for it.
Thank you again. I really appreciate you being here. You're a big part of the North Carolina Masonic Research Society. We enjoy having you. In fact, just for those that don't know, you were our first speaker ever when we first formed, and you've been a big part ever since. So we really appreciate that.
I can't wait to be there again in person. Knock wood. Knock wood. We'll all be doing this in person. Sometime in the not distant future. Let's hope.
I hope so as well. For anyone who doesn't know, Mitch gives the best hugs ever. So looking forward to that. But Mitch, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for being here with us. And we hope we will see you next time.
All right. Thanks to everybody. Appreciate it very much. Thank you. Good night. See you soon. Thank you.